Corinthians chapter 9. We'll be finishing up that chapter, perhaps getting into chapter 10 this evening, but we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, working on finishing up that chapter here in just a moment. Before we get into chapter 9, we're going to remind ourselves of our outline and then review chapter 8. Again, like we did on Sunday morning, catching us up to where we are as chapters 8, 9, and 10 are a unit of chapters dealing with the same issue. The book of 1 Corinthians, the theme that we said that the book has is about contentions among you. And Paul wrote about that, key verse being chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, where he had to write to them to be no divisions because he had heard there were some contentions there among them. The outline of the book divides itself down into 4 sections. The first of those is problems Paul had learned by report. So the divisions, I am with Paul, I am with Apollos, I am with Cephas, and I am with Christ. Those divisions Paul learned by report by way of the household of Chloe, according to chapter 1. In chapter 5 and chapter 6 was the problem of fornication. We know chapter 5, the fornicator among them, had been reported. He said it is actually reported that there is fornication among you. In chapter 6, seems to be problems, or some problems reported as well. Chapter 5, not only is there the problem of fornication among them, there's the problem of the lack of discipline. And then in chapter 6, not only is there the problem of fornication dealt with, but the problem of litigation and going to law against one another. It's then, in chapter 7, we have a shift, or a transition, into the second major section, and that is questions the Corinthians asked Paul. Chapter 7 began with, now concerning the things about which you wrote. And then Paul, in chapter 7, chapter 8, and all the way through chapter 14 is dealing with those things. In chapter 7, twice in chapter 8, and then again in chapter 12, it's brought up now concerning. And it seems to be the shift there about the questions he's dealing with, the questions you had about marriage. Now concerning the questions about the eating of these meat sacrificed to idols, so on and so forth. And so those issues, they ask about, again, marriage, meat sacrificed to idols, the covering, abuse of the Lord's Supper, and spiritual gifts. Chapter 15, then, is false teaching on the resurrection. And chapter 16 is the collection for the needy saints and some salutations given there. We're in the second section, questions the Corinthians ask Paul. We're in subpoint B, meats sacrificed to idols. We've already covered chapter 8, and we covered part of chapter 9 on Sunday morning, though we'll review that to get us to where we are here in a moment. But let's quickly remind ourselves about chapter 8. Again, chapter 8, just like chapter 7, begins with these 2 words, now concerning. Again, it seems to be a question they ask him. He said, now concerning food offered to idols, and we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And we noted last Wednesday evening in chapter 8, the English Standard Version would note there, not all translations do, but it has that phrase, all of us possess knowledge, in quotation marks. And I think that's an accurate reflection there. It seems this is their attitude saying, we all possess knowledge. Why then is this a problem of eating meat sacrificed to idols? That's why later on Paul would point out in verse 7, not all possess this knowledge. It seems they were saying we all have knowledge, and Paul was saying, now wait a minute, not all possess this knowledge. Not that they believe an idol is equal with God. There were those that obeyed the gospel who they didn't believe an idol was equal with God, or that an idol was really a God, but they couldn't help but associate that with idol worship because they had grown up in that. He then, coming in verse 9, after talking about that not all possess this knowledge that an idol is nothing, and said the liberty they have, the right they have, that is of the eating of this meat from the marketplace, that liberty or right could become a stumbling block to the weak, verse 9. He said in verse 10, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? Now, we pointed out verse 10 is not saying you can go to the idol's temple and eat that food. That's what seems to be the attitude perhaps some of them had, that if we could go to the temple and eat this because we know that it's not really anything, and yet that meal was done in honor. But rather, it seems verse 10 is more an exaggeration to point out you're saying, well, there's nothing wrong, and perhaps some of you have the attitude we could go to the temple and eat. And Paul's saying, listen, by your eating, what you're doing is your brother may look at that and say, you know what? If temple, then I can eat the meat from the marketplace. But then they eat that, and they don't really eat from faith. They have a weak conscience, and then because of that, he said in verse 11, they are destroyed. The brother for whom Christ died. He said in verse 12 that when we do this, we set that stumbling block in front of a brother's way, that we sin not only against the brother, but against Christ. It's then in verse 13 that Paul points out, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. What Paul's saying in verse 13 is, if my right, if my liberty could cause somebody else to sin, then what I need to do is give up that right, give up that liberty. Not completely and totally. They didn't have to quit eating meat altogether. But if you've got brother so-and-so here and brother so-and-so here, and this one can't eat meat and this one can, and this one invites the other over, he should be serving him the meat from the marketplace. Not that you can't eat that in the privacy of your own home, if there's nothing wrong with that, but you shouldn't be setting a stumbling block in one's way. Well, it seems we pointed out on Sunday, there are those here at Corinth who are heavily critical of Paul, more so than any of the other apostles. And particularly in the second epistle, they're critical of him. And Paul has to defend his apostleship at length. But here in the first one, it seems that some of them seem to question in the first few verses if he's really an apostle. Because he didn't take his right to support. Look at verse 1 beginning. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. And so it seems there's those that seem to have the doubt, is he really an apostle? He's not receiving support for his work like Peter is, or like John is. And again, 2 Corinthians goes into more detail for this defense of his apostleship. But it seems some of them seem to have the attitude, well, is he really an apostle? And that's when he asks the question, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? He gives us qualification. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Remember in Acts chapter 1 when they went to appoint Matthias, that one of the qualifications given for an apostle was he had to have seen the resurrected Christ. That's why the Lord appears to then Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus to qualify him as one born out of due time to be an apostle. And he says, I've seen him, and are you not my workmanship? People may doubt, what Paul's saying is people may doubt my apostleship, but you shouldn't. Why shouldn't they? They are his, verse 2, his seal of his apostleship. They had seen the work that he had done. Everything that he had done. The miracles worked in his time among them. The preaching done among them. He's saying, if people may doubt that I'm an apostle, but you shouldn't be. You've seen this. He then comes in verse 3 and says, this is my defense to those who would examine me. So again, maybe their questioning his apostleship are going to be questioning him as, would you really do that? Paul says, here's my defense, beginning at verse 3. He said, I've denied liberties. Now when we get down to verse 15, here in a moment where we left off on Sunday, we'll pick back up and cover that some more. But let's just start at verse 4 again. Verse 4, 5, and 6, really 4 and 5 are two liberties, and 6 through 14 is another liberty. But they all tie together. Verse 4, do we not have a right to eat and drink? Now we said on Sunday, perhaps he's talking about they have the right to eat the meat like he told the others they had the right to, but they should deny it. But as we said, it seems that in the broader context of what he's saying, or in the context of what he's saying, in chapter 9, is rather or not we have the right to eat and drink, we have the right to support for the work we do in order to eat and drink, and to receive support so that we might eat and drink. In verse 5, he says, do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? As we said, perhaps Paul is arguing that he had forwent his liberty to be married so that he could be preaching and he didn't have to worry about having a wife with him and everything, so he could keep his mind focused purely on the gospel. That's true, but I don't think that's what Paul's saying in verse 5. Rather, the King James Version would render that, have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as the other apostles? And it seems Paul's point is, we have the right to support that if we have a wife, a believing wife, to take her along with us. and we be supported for taking her along with us as well. We use the illustration, if somebody has a meeting with a preacher from the other side of the country, and the preacher's wife comes with him, and they fly in, the church might cover his ticket to travel in, and they might cover hers to travel in with him, because she goes with him. And so that seems to be the point here, is we have the right to the support so that we can eat and drink. We have the right to the support to take along a believing, or lead along a believing wife. And then we just flat out have the right to support, period, in verse 6. To take those wages, to receive that support. He said in verse 6, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Are we the only ones? You don't have a problem supporting the others, but it seems as if he's saying, is it just me and Barnabas that don't have the right to receive support for the work we do? He uses 3 illustrations in verse 7. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense, who plants a vineyard without eating of its fruit, or who tends to a flock without getting some of the milk. And so as we said in verse 7, he uses 3 illustrations. If you're a soldier, what does a soldier receive for their work as a soldier? They receive a wage, a payment for that. What about one who has a vineyard? Do you expect somebody to grow a vineyard and not eat of what they reap from the vineyard? No, if you have a vineyard, you have the right to eat from it, to receive that as a wage for the working of that. Or the one who tends the flock gets some of the milk. But then Paul comes in verse 8 after using those illustrations and says, do I say these things on human authority? Paul's saying, am I just saying this from the human standpoint? He gives the point that no, it does not. He says, does not the law say the same? Does not the law point out that one has a right to receive their work, or to receive wages for their work in the gospel? He then quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 25 and in verse 4, in which it says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. And then he asks this question, is it for oxen that God is concerned? Was that written because God was so concerned about the ox treading the grain? Or is he saying, is that not making the point that we should receive some support for the work that is done? Does he not, verse 10, certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher should thresh in hope, of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? And so he's pointing out, listen, if we sow these spiritual things among you, do we not have the right to reap some material payment or wage for the work that we've done? He asks him in verse 12, is it just somebody else's rightful claim to that? You're willing to support others. But Paul's saying, is it me and Barnabas? Are we the ones that just don't have the right to that kind of support? He's pointing out, if others have that claim, do not we even more? And I think his point is, we were the ones that came in. Paul was the one that came in and helped start the church there at Corinth, and spend time there to help the work get off the ground. And yet they seem that they're questioning Paul and not these others. He said in verse 12, nevertheless, we have not made use of the right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. We pointed out there is a sense in which Paul's receiving of support might have become a hindrance to the gospel. We said perhaps the hindrance might have been because of their view of him already. Remember, as we said earlier, they viewed Paul very critically. Anything they could find to critique about Paul, they were going to critique about Paul. If they could criticize him, they were going to criticize him. And so if Paul had received support, there might have been some, with the attitude they possessed towards him, that said, you know what? You know what Paul's doing? He's simply in it for the money. And so perhaps that had become a hindrance to the gospel. Perhaps he didn't want to add just more criticism on top. Not give them any more reason to criticize because they were already critical enough of him. And so he thought, you know what, I'm not going to give them any more reason to criticize. Whatever it was, Paul says, my receiving the support might have been an obstacle to the gospel. And so because of that, I have that right, but I have foregone that right. I've given up that right to receive support from you, not to hinder the gospel. Verse 13 then, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? Now we said on Sunday this is not a quotation, but an allusion to Leviticus 6 and 7. As opposed to the earlier verse, it's not a direct quote, but it's alluding to the principles you'll find in those two chapters about the priest receiving some of what was offered to eat. Verse 14 then, in the same way the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So he said, the priest had the right to eat what was offered, right? He points out in verse 13, you shall not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. He uses all these illustrations, and it leads to this point in verse 14, that the Lord had commanded those who proclaim the gospel should get their living how? By the gospel, by preaching the gospel. Last a little more time reviewing to catch us up to where we are in the latter half, but important to lead us into verse 15 now, where we left off on Sunday morning, where Paul talks about his decision to forego these liberties. Let's begin at verse 15 and go through verse 18. He lists two reasons here he gave in this section for giving it. Two he listed in 15 through 23 for giving it up. The first is found in 15 through 18. He forewent his liberty, lest he abuse it. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that would give me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel. There's a couple of things to point out here. Paul points out first in verse 15, he's not writing to make this argument now to try to convince them that they should send him support. He says in verse 15, I have no use of any of these rights. Paul had enough to live on. And we know from Philippians, Paul had learned in whatever state he was in to be content. Paul had worked as a tent maker. He had enough to live on. Paul says, I'm not writing to this to sort of make you feel guilty for not supporting me in my work. In fact, he said at the end of the verse, I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. Now, I'm not saying I want to come here so I have the right to be proud and boast and look, I didn't receive what I could have received. That's not what Paul's saying. Rather, what Paul's saying is, I have declined this support to not hinder the gospel. If I then turn around and am making this argument to tell you to give me support, I have just rendered my entire point ineffective. So let's put it back in its context. Okay, we've been dealing with the wages, but let's put it in the broader context. 8, 9, and 10 is a unit of chapters about what main issue? The eating of meats. The eating of meat sacrificed to idols. Chapter 8, Paul said at the end that if my liberty, which in this case was specifically the eating of meat, but if that liberty, if that right causes someone else to stumble, we should then not eat meat, right? Forego that liberty. Then some of them might have argued, Paul, would you really do it? Paul's arguing in this text, I have foregone liberties. I've set an example for you. And so what Paul's saying in verse 15 is, if I'm turning around and saying, you know what, I'm boasting about declining this so that maybe you'll send something my way and support me, Paul's entire point is ineffective, it's void. Right? This whole point was for nothing. His point is that I don't want to send this to you so that you send me support. I'm making the point to illustrate to you that I've foregone my liberties. He points out that he forewent his liberty for preaching. He felt, not because he was in it for the money, but because he felt, verse 16, a necessity to preach. If I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. I was told one time, I was told one time when working with Donnie when he was there, and I've heard him tell others the same thing that is thought about preaching. Don't preach unless you have to. And what he means by that is, don't preach because you think, well, you know what, that's a good way to make money. Or don't preach because I think, you know what, it's an easy thing to do. Preach because you feel the obligation to preach. What Paul is saying in this text is, I preach the gospel not because I'm in it for the money. I preach the gospel because I feel that obligation. Right? That necessity upon him. It's not because he's in it for the money or because he finds it an easy thing to do. It's because he feels that's what he needs to be doing and he's got that necessity upon him. Yes?
Yeah, I got in my Bible, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. I have that underlined. We should feel the same way, woe to me if I don't teach about Jesus Christ or talk to somebody about Jesus Christ. Because why be a Christian if you're not going to spread the news and share it with somebody so they can be saved too?
Right, absolutely. And that's the attitude that Paul has here as he talks about, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a stewardship. I think what Paul's pointing out in verse 17, tying into that, is if I do it of my own will, not in the sense that he didn't preach because he wanted to preach, but if I do it because it's something I can do. Right? I've heard people say before, well, if whatever, and some of them are joking, and I think some of them are serious, if whatever it is doesn't work out, well, at least there's always preaching. As if there's something to fall back on that's simple. That attitude's not going to convert very many people, because then you're only simply in it for having a job to do. But I think it's point in verse 17, if I do it of my own will, I have a reward. That is, if I'm doing it because I just want to do it to have the money, I would be working to obtain a reward. But he says, but if not, of my own will. That is, he has that necessity laid upon him that he has to preach, then I am still entrusted with the stewardship. So he's saying, I'm not in it because I want some great reward from it. I have a necessity laid upon me, and in that necessity, I am a steward. Remember going back to the earlier chapters, that preachers are stewards of the mystery of God. And the qualification of a steward is they must be found faithful. So Paul is teaching and preaching this message as a steward, taking this message and sharing it with others as a faithful steward. Yes?
I was thinking, like in the Old Testament, Moses, when he come to age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season. Moses, it seems, had all these riches of Egypt at his disposal. Okay, he chose to lead the Israelites out, and then their ingratitude and murmuring and complaining. Well, Paul, he had a prominent place in Judaism. So if he was in it for some type of physical thing, he would have remained in Judaism. I think also there with him and Silas were incarcerated there in Philippi, I believe it's Acts chapter 16 we read about. Well, when the prison was miraculously opened, okay, he told the jailer, don't do yourself any harm. Okay, some of us maybe would have thought of that later after he'd already taken his own life. But I believe Paul was constantly looking for somebody. Well, two things. People that were already in the body of Christ to build up their faith, but also anyone that's lost, he saw them as the eternal bound preacher. So the point is, these people should have been able to observe what he had done for the cause of Christ. And he shouldn't even have made these points. That was more of a reflection on their inability to see this man. John 15, 15:9, I think says, the Father is glorified when we bear much fruit. Well, Paul's life was full of fruit. Then he wrote to the churches of Galatia, he bore in his body the marks of Jesus. And I don't know if he means the physical marks that he was saying because of his service to God. I don't know. That's what sometimes I tend to think. But his even physical body would have made declaration of his service to Christ. And they should have seen that.
You're right, and they should have been willing to share in him because of all the work he had done among them. But instead, they were critiquing him even though he was compelled by love to teach and preach the gospel. They were viewing it more from that human standpoint we saw in the earlier chapters. Yes.
This does not affect the outcome of the gospel either. Because when Paul was in prison, he said, this is making other people preach the gospel, which is good. But some are doing it for filthy lucre's sake to make money. But still, Christ is being preached. Just like in your sermon on Sunday night, the Indian in the Bible, he says, no, you must have the wrong Bible. Yeah. No, he read the Bible, he saw what God said to do. So, even though that minute, the guy that gave it to him, said, we're coming in here, this is what we're going to use to baptize you. And he said, I must have the wrong Bible. I said, no. The gospel was preached to him, and he studied it, and he knew exactly what he needed to do.
You're right, and there are those who may do it from an improper motive that are still maybe teaching the truth. And so somebody listen and obey that, and then they'll still be saved. But the extent of their work may be with that attitude would be affected to the point that Paul, being willing to go do it for no support and for because he felt obligated to teach, is going to go far above and beyond what some of those others would do, which makes him even more effective in the kingdom than just simply wanting to do whatever was best for his financial gain. Yes.
Yeah, I said something that makes a point what you just said. Of course, we're seeing from the text here that it wasn't about money. It has been before with preachers. It could be again or whatever. God knows that. But besides that, when he wrote to the church of Philippi, he said that there were those who were preaching gospel out of strife, selfish ambition, envy, which in Galatians 5 said they're all work of the flesh. But apparently the substance of what they were saying is correct, or he wouldn't have meant it. He said either way, in love or pretense, the word's being preached. So the point is that even when you preach the gospel, you know, if it's for, because it says those that practice envy, strife, and selfish ambition, they're going to go into hell for eternity. So it's so ironic that Paul said those people were preaching, but hoping to add affliction to his bonds. Why not go ahead and establish the love you should for your brothers in Christ and lead people to Christ and get the reward yourself? So I just thought about that, like you said, when it comes to motivation. You know, it could be a lot of different things that were wrong, but if it's speaking the truth in love, Ephesians 4:15, that's the right.
Absolutely. Let's pick up now in verse 18. So we've been talking about him not preaching for the support, right? He hasn't received the support. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of the gospel. Now, Paul's not saying here, by the way, we pointed this out Sunday, that he never received support. He's going to thank those in Philippians for their support. He's going to talk, I believe it's in the second letter that he wrote, but he talks to those at Corinth about having received church support from others while working among them. But he didn't receive support from them in order to not make it ineffective with them. Which again, going back to the eating of meats. Paul's not saying you can never eat meat, but when it comes to that liberty possibly hindering somebody else, and you eating it in that moment may hinder them, you need to forego that liberty. Let's pick up in verse 19 now. Paul talks about the second reason that he has foregone his liberties, and that is to gain and save more people. So he points out in verse 19, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. So to the Jews I became a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Now, a lot of those things you read through, and everything Paul said, and I became the weak, and I was not under the law, was not under the law. We can simply summarize it this way. Paul's point here, in that he is, as he says down here later on, I have become all things to all people. Paul's not compromising. He's not talking about compromising. He still believes and practices the same thing. I think we have examples of this, of Paul becoming all things to all men. For example, in Acts chapter 20, you may recall when we were studying the book of Acts, Paul comes to Jerusalem. And the elders at the church of Jerusalem met with him, and when he came, as he's giving a report, and told him that it had been reported, and some of the Jews there had heard, that he said you cannot keep any customs of the law of Moses. Not that they were binding. They agreed they were not binding. Or you couldn't tie those upon the Jews. The Gentiles. But there were Jews who still felt they should keep some of those customs of the law. So what does Paul do in Acts chapter 20? What do the elders recommend and Paul goes through and does? He keeps the custom of the Jews. But when Paul's among the Gentiles, what's he going to do? That which makes it most effective with the Gentiles. Not hindering, again, not compromising, not doing anything wrong, but when it comes to their customs that he can keep, he's going to keep what he can with them to make it more effective. I heard a preacher say one time, you go to other countries, and he's gone and done some work overseas, and they may dress differently, or in their country they may wear a head covering, and we'll get to that passage in 1 Corinthians 11 later on and discuss it, we're willing, probably in a couple of weeks. But, they were covering here and says, you know what I do? What I told my wife, if we go there, she needs to do? Best thing to do would be to wear the one, because it makes it more effective there among them, because they might feel as though you're not respecting them and their culture. Is there anything wrong with wearing? No. So, best thing to do to make it more effective is become all things to all people, right? You go to different places and the cultures are different. When there's not a matter of right or wrong, the best thing to do is to follow their cultures and customs, and it makes it the gospel more effective, because they don't feel like you're disrespecting them when you come. And so if Paul had gone to the Jews and said, no, I'm not keeping any of the customs of the Jews, they would have already shut their ears. If Paul goes to the Gentiles and he's focused upon the customs of the Jews and turns his back on the customs of the Gentiles, they might have not listened. That's what Paul's saying. I've become all things to all people. I've done what I can where there's these liberties. I've foregone liberties to do whatever is best for the sake of the gospel. But again, the key is he has foregone his liberties. Matters of, as we said the other day, they are matters of indifference to God. Not matters of right or wrong.
That's not totally removed today from how someone would teach or preach the Word of God. Somebody, if you're studying individually and you know something about their background, you might take different approaches to different people. You might have to establish fundamental things like authority and stuff with some people. Other people may have already had that established. But I guess you just have to have a little bit of wisdom and pray for that wisdom so you know how to navigate, because you don't want to shut somebody down. Like you say, you never compromise the truth, but yet you do what's right in of itself, and you take different approaches to different people, and I think that's what Paul said that he done.
Yes, absolutely. And because of that, his reason for doing that was that by all means I might save some. Now, is he going to save everybody? No. But is he going to save more by becoming all things to all men than if he'd just done whatever he wanted and followed all his liberties? Yes. And that's just one. Let's look at the last few verses here, and then on Sunday we pick up in chapter 10. 24 through 27, liberties are denied so as not to become disqualified. He illustrates this with games or sporting events. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one who beats the air. But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should become disqualified. Paul's saying here, you look at 24 through 27 and you just read it after everything you said, and it kind of stands out because it doesn't, at first glance, it doesn't look like it fits, right? It's kind of different than everything else. But here's his point he's making. If you're running a race, what do you need to have? You need to have some endurance. Endurance, and you need to have some, verse 27, discipline. Have you ever seen, here next year we're having the 2024 Summer Olympics, and sometimes during the Olympic Games they'll put up, talk about some athlete. I believe they did this with Michael Phelps when he was winning all those gold medals. And it talks about his strict training regimen and how much he eats and how he has to watch what he eats and is it having enough calories and all this. You know what that takes to do all that? Some discipline. And Paul's using that, the physical races, or the boxing, as an illustration to say that what we need in running the Christian race is some discipline. What discipline requires, or what discipline leads to, is us having the proper kind of self-control that he says is needed in verse 25. Every athlete exercises self-control. So here's his point. Does Paul have a right to these liberties? Yes, he has a right to these liberties. Could Paul get in a mindset, if he's not careful, where he says, you know what, I have the right, I'm going to take that right? Yes, he can get in that mindset. What does it take to stay in the proper mindset? It takes some discipline and some self-control. If he doesn't have that discipline and self-control, and he goes in, he may not deny he may go and have those things he has a right to, but by it he may put an obstacle in the way of the gospel, which might cause somebody to fall away, which then means Paul himself has become disqualified. Because he sinned against his brother and against God. And so that's Paul's point, is that he has to use the self-control as an athlete would in running the Christian race and denying his liberties. Lord willing, we'll pick up and start chapter 10 on Sunday morning. Quick note for chapter 10. When you get to the end of chapter 10, read the next verse, the first verse of chapter 11. It's an unfortunate chapter break. Verse 1 of chapter 11 goes with chapter 10, not chapter 11. And so we'll go all the way through. If we get through the chapter, we'll go to verse 1 of chapter 11 on Sunday morning.